supports whatever idea you're debating about is morally inconsistent, right? And then lastly, does it establish a uniform formula that's universally applicable, right? So if the principle of justice isn't uniform, what it means is that there's so much space for people to change it and tweak it to favor themselves. This is where you have independent courts that don't necessarily follow the law, but make new laws on a daily basis. So that lack of uniformity in how we met out justice within society is what will be problematic. What you usually find with both forms of justice, whether it's the objective good or you deserve what you get form of justice, is states will follow one or the other. With the majority of their laws, they'll either fall on one or the other side of the coin, right? So, is it absolute? Who thinks that justice is an absolute concept? Just like show of hands. Who thinks justice isn't absolute? That would be all of you. Alright, so why do you think justice isn't absolute?
Because, I mean, justice is a concept. For everyone, justice is something else. So it cannot be absolutely so many variables are considered in.
Alright, so if, as a society, we collectively decide what we believe justice to be, is that justice that we decide upon absolute? Like,
no.
If there are no variables within our justice, if we decide this is the justice we want, is that form of justice absolute? Why not?
Because there arises new situations that, like you say, changing circumstances need you to view justice in a different manner. Like if you say killing is wrong, then, or if you give someone the right to life, then you're basically saying, even if the person is good, Basically, if you have the right to life, it does not mean that the state cannot take your life away. Because there are certain instances where if someone is defending themselves, then they have the right to take your life away. So the society views it as absolute, but it is not always applied absolutely because of different circumstances.
All right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that is actually the majority of it, right? What you do when you're faced with a question of whether or not something is absolute is you look at, firstly, the concept itself and what it seeks to achieve, right? So if what justice is trying to achieve are those four things, social welfare, right? The question is, can justice, regardless of who is meting out that justice, always be applied uniformly to achieve those things? If it can't always be applied uniformly, and there's circumstances that need to change how justice is applied, then justice can't be a uniform or an absolute concept, because it requires tweaking in order for it to work in society. An absolute concept is a concept where, regardless of like 20, 30, 40 years from now, regardless of who's meting it out, it will always remain uniform. The minute you have to change something in order to ensure that you don't favor other people and have a negative bias to other people, that change is what removes the absolution from something, right? So that was more like just generally philosophically what justice is like all about and what it's trying to achieve within society. We're going to go into more technical, like legal stuff now. So does anyone have any like philosophical general questions on justice?
Can I just say to you guys, like in the senior debate, we were debating Oscar. Those of you that weren't in it, you guys can watch the video. But like there was from one of the teams that they argued that the way in which, remember we debated media coverage of Oscar stories, that one of the team's arguments was, well, the way in which the media has covered this trial means that we haven't achieved justice. And like, I don't know if you guys remember, but like in adjudication and in feedback to speakers, I said, it's really important for you guys to tell us what exactly you view justice as. Okay, so like, it's not just to sound straight, I have to remember all of this random shit. Like, we've done it within our debate society already. Okay, and I feel like we may debate Oscar. Okay, so if you guys are going to run an argument about justice, make sure you have his notes with you. Okay.
We probably will debate Oscar at like just normal. And the idea is this, right? If you have a general understanding of what justice is all about, you can easily define it in a way that benefits your case. You can tell the House what you want justice to be on that day, and then that's what informs the rest of the debate. And you've already set yourself at an advantage if you're an open government, right? So basically, that's justice. And in terms of like justice, the Oscar trial, we also had like a debate about it back home. Teams will just say like, why is justice a good thing? And totally challenge that the principle of justice is too subjective and too like uncoded for it to be a good thing because people can always abuse it. Because you can't clearly define what justice is, how can you then be able to pinpoint whether justice is good or not if if justice is always able to change it. So if you're saying we're trying to achieve justice, we're saying you are going to achieve justice, but justice isn't a good thing, and that's what puts you in a very, very position. So let's look at criminal liability, right? So basically, general definition of crime, simplistic, unlawful act or omission to act that gives rise to criminal liability. What then becomes criminal liability? It's liability arising from a broken legal duty to act or not to act. Now, the reason I underlined legal duty is there was this really popular case that occurred, I don't know if it was like China or like Japan or one of those places, where there was a video of a little girl who died on the street, and people literally just like walked over her. People were jumping over her and walking on and just carrying on with their lives. So that brought like a public debate about whether or not we have an obligation to act to help people who are in like lesser position than us or who are unable to help themselves. So the difference between a legal duty and a moral duty becomes really important in debates. Because a lot of times debates will try to push onto your burden and say you have a duty to act when that duty isn't necessarily a legal duty and it is a moral duty. And it's really easy to like defend whether or not you have a moral duty, and the whole like the general idea of like how morality differs and isn't uniform, therefore it's really difficult to describe what the duties under morality are, but it's difficult to defend whether or not you have a legal duty. So we're going to look at that, right? Every crime has two elements. I think the law students here will know this. The actus rea and the mens rea. The actus rea basically is the action itself. So you have to be the one that carries out the crime. You have to have done something that was unlawful or that was criminal, and that kind of behavior is then illegal, right? The second element is the mens rea. Now this is the mental element in committing a crime, and this will be very popular with the whole Oscar crime. The idea of was there or was there not an intention to kill. Because when you remove any one of these elements from a crime, then it no longer is a crime. It may be like a generally bad thing, but it's not a crime anymore, and we can't hold you criminally liable. So for example, I'll be with you in half a second. So for example, if I am sitting in like church or something, right? And I'm tapping my foot on the floor, and my phone rings and I've won the lotto, and I jump up off my seat and punch an old lady, and she dies. There is no intention to commit a crime there, right? But I did technically commit a crime because I have caused the death of another individual. The difficulty there is they can't hold me accountable for murder. They can barely even hold me accountable for manslaughter because there was absolutely no intention. I don't know this person. I've never met them before in my life. It's just that the chain of causation meant that the way I acted resulted in a bad thing happening. So in many debates, if you can prove that the chain of causation doesn't necessarily mean that someone had the requisite mental intention to commit a crime, then you remove the label of crime from it, and it no longer becomes a crime. It becomes like another bad thing that we can absolutely talk about sanctioning within society in a different way, but it's not a criminal act that can be sanctioned in a criminal way.
Yes. So what happens in a case where there's an instigator that suggests killing someone else, and then someone else actually kills that person? What happens to the first person that suggested this?
Right. Because that's actually a brilliant question. You see how I wrote including causation in it, right? Now, when you instigate someone to go and commit a crime, without your instigation, that crime wouldn't have occurred. So the chain of causation really starts with you. So the actus rea, although it was carried out by another individual, began with you. In the absence of you, there would have been no actus rea, so we can still hold you accountable for a crime. Although we're not going to hold you accountable for murder, we'll hold you accountable for a different crime like conspiracy to commit, or like where you incite people to commit. There are various crimes under that we can hold you accountable for. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to hold you accountable for the full crime. But the fact is, we're still going to be able to hold you accountable for the crime because the action began with you. Without you, there would have been no action. Right? Anything else? Right, good. So let's look at motions that this house will criminalize, this house will legalize. It's motions that generally have to do with you acting in a certain way that limits people's civil liberties or other sorts of liberties within society. Right? So what you first want to look at, if you're talking about prostitution or abortion or whatever, right? You set it up against the metric already established. Does it meet the requirements or can it be tweaked to meet the requirements of a crime? So prostitution, for example, if you want to criminalize it, does it meet the requirements of a crime? Is there an action and is there an intention to do something bad? To the extent that you can prove that those two elements exist, then you can prove that it needs to be criminalized. But if you can't prove that those two elements exist, then you could probably argue that it needs to be like a civil wrong that people can be sued for doing, like bigamy or whatever, but you can't prove that it's a crime that needs to be criminalized. I actually watched a very interesting debate that was won by a closing government team, and they were arguing for the criminalizing of prostitution, I think it was, prostitution or abortion, one of those things. And what basically happened is the first half, and like everyone just conceded that, okay, you know what, hopefully government says we want to criminalize it, these people are doing bad things. These ones were saying like, look, these people are free people, they should be able to have all these liberties, right? The closing basically just said, look, we need to look at criminalizing. When we criminalize something, what are the requirements? It needs to meet the requirements of a crime in A, B, C, and D. Can prostitution meet those requirements in A, B, C, and D? And to the extent that they proved that it needs to be criminalized, they won that debate. They didn't win the bigger, more philosophical debate about whether or not prostitution is right or prostitution is wrong. They just proved that prostitution can be tweaked to fit into what we term a crime. And that's how they won the debate. So the ability to be more technical and decide where you slot yourself into the debate came handy, right? So it does help to know, right? Secondly, what are the perceptive consequences of criminalizing? Because every time you criminalize something, and there's an example I love that occurred in the United States in the 1960s, 70s, I think it was. The United States government decided, you know what, we're going to make alcohol illegal. You can't buy, you can't sell, you can't drink. So they criminalized it. What then happened is people just didn't respect the law. Absolutely no one followed the law, which meant it was extremely difficult for the United States government to take everyone and throw them in jail. So that's basically like society en masse deciding that they're not going to respect the law. So if you don't take into consideration the consequences of you criminalizing something and how society may respond to that, then you run the chance of having an opposing team saying, look, it's a good idea, it's nice and everything, but it can't practically happen because this is how people will respond to it. And the larger argument there is if people start disrespecting one law, they learn to disrespect the next law, and they end up believing like the system of justice just isn't representative of them, and then you have a rogue society. So you need to look at the consequences of criminalizing something and what that means for the larger society.
I've heard like a very controversial thing called ETOL, and it's because they may be an argument for it as mass disobedience or like it's impossible for government to really sanction everyone.
Yeah, true. Like to the extent that you can prove that a majority of people in South Africa won't buy into the system, like even if the system stays there for 2-3 years, people just still won't buy into it, then you can prove that it's an illegitimate law or it shouldn't have been legalized. So to the point that you can prove that there's mass support for what you're talking about, then that legitimately does fall into that category. Right. The problem with, and I guess this is the counter argument to it, is that people always listen to authority, and regardless of how they feel right now, generally over time people get used to things. So you pass laws that people may generally not like in society right now, but like 1-2 generations down the line, people will buy into it, and the law will start to be respected because we see our neighbors being arrested and we don't want to be arrested. So it really is like you have to weigh it on a balance of, is the support against what you're arguing enough to ensure that even 2 generations from now, people won't support it? So for example, things like forcing every family to kill their firstborn, right? Things like that, 2 generations, 3 generations, it doesn't matter how many generations from now, people will never buy into that. But more simple things like limiting how people can have babies by fining them, people will eventually buy into because it's a lot easier for you to hold those people accountable, right?
Yeah, then I'm just trying to put it onto something else. Now you spoke about the prostitution because there's an action happening and the intent of doing the action. Now, how does that relate to smoking weed? Because sometimes you would go on to say that this house would legalize weed. Now, arguing against that, how is that action? Because it doesn't harm anyone except for the smoker, and
it's right. Thank you, and I've forgotten that. That's actually a very brilliant question, right? Why is the mens rea so important? So why is the element of my intention to commit a crime more detrimental to everyone else than to me? So if you look at weed smokers, for example, when they go out and smoke weed, even if it's only like physically harming them, the harm then is you're breeding a society where people like buy into a norm of it's okay to want to like disobey authority. And that's where like the okaying disobeying authority grows and leads into something else. This is why they tell you that when someone commits one crime, the likelihood of them committing another and another and another is that much higher because the psychology of crime is so addictive. So the danger of having a mens rea when you're committing a crime is that that mens rea can spill over into other forms of crime. So to the extent that you can show that it's harmful for you to have like a mens rea to do bad things, like just malicious intent, regardless of whether it actively harms other people or not, by showing how it harms your obedience to authority and how you fit into the whole social contract, then you can prove that it's a bad thing. Anyone else? You good? All right, cool. Anyone else? Yeah. Right. So, enforceability, I think we've sort of like covered it under what the consequences are. Like, is the law enforceable? We've already talked about this. But the second element to enforceability is you need to look at the symbolic value of passing a law, even if you are unable to enforce it all the time. And I think like the weed smoking is a perfect law because there's like a universal example with it. Like smoking weed is extremely legal in many states across the world. But people do it like on a daily basis. People even do it like crossing streets, right? So it's something that's extremely difficult to enforce. But the idea is that the symbolism behind saying smoking weed is illegal is what the government is supporting. So what the government is basically saying, look, doing this is a bad thing. And whether or not we are able to stop you from doing it, we're going to pass the message that it's a bad thing. Because it's our duty to weed out bad things from society and encourage good things in the society. So there's like two elements to it. There's whether or not you're going to be able to do it, and there's the symbolic value of it. Is there any sort of like good symbol that you're passing on to society to say, this is something that's bad to do, don't do it, right? And it's like, I guess things like privacy and incest. You can't really police those things because you don't have like a bedroom force unit. You don't know what goes on in people's houses. But you are able to say that incest is a bad thing, and as a government you stand against it. And that's sort of got to do also with like government imagery and what the role of government is. See, like a majority of the things you argue will always be able to be linked back to what the role of government is. And to the extent that you can establish the role of government is to like look after people, ensure social welfare, and ensure that like, all good things happen in society or whatever, everything bad that happens, you can prove that the government has a fundamental duty to act against those bad things. So whether that actually will be lucrative is a debate for a totally other day, but the action is important because you have a duty to do it, right? Right, and then let's look at sanctioning crimes, right? So every time you have to criminalize something, you will need to go into a bit of detail of what the sanction is. Because there's no point saying we're going to criminalize people jaywalking if you can't tell us what you're going to do when people jaywalk. Because every law needs to have a sanction. A law without a sanction is just like a statement that we all have to follow, but we don't really have to follow it because we're not afraid of it, right? So when you're coming up with a sanction, you need to look at a number of things. Is it reasonable? Does it act as an active deterrent? And does it have any rehabilitational value, right? So in terms of it being reasonable, there's a perfect example that Riddian Morgan used in like one of his one lectures. He was saying that back in the 1800s, I think it was 1700s, there were like almost 250 offenses in England that were punishable by death. So like stealing, punishable by death, like just all these offenses, 250 of them. So what then happened is, if you were caught stealing because you knew that you were going to be taken to the gallows and had your head chopped off, you had an incentive to kill the police officer who was arresting you so that you wouldn't get caught. So because the punishment was so unreasonable, it actually incentivized you to commit more crime so you could get out of the punishment. So you always have to bring a balance between like whether or not it's a reasonable punishment or it's so extreme that you're actually incentivizing people to A1, do more crimes, or A2, do the crimes they're doing already in a better way, right? So it needs to be strong enough that it scares people away from committing these crimes, but not too strong so as to scare people into committing more crimes, right? That's whether it's reasonable, whether it acts as an active deterrent, right? So for example, if you're going